The sun had just begun to rise above the dusty hills when Daniel Whitmore tightened the straps on his old leather boots and stepped out of his small wooden cabin. The morning air was crisp, cool enough to bite at his cheeks, but the promise of daylight warmed his spirit. A thin layer of frost covered the dry grass, sparkling under the first golden rays. His rifle hung loosely over his shoulder, more a symbol of habit than pride. It had been with him through many long days of wandering through the wilderness. Daniel was a hunter, but not one who hunted for sport. Out here, far from any town or trading post, meat was more than food. It was survival. The past weeks had been lean. The traps he had set in the northern valley caught nothing but cold wind. The creeks had frozen earlier than usual, and even the rabbits seemed to have vanished into the earth. His small store of dried venison was almost gone, and he could not ignore the growing ache of hunger in his stomach. He moved slowly through the early light, his steps silent on the frozen soil. The world around him was still. Only the distant cry of a hawk and the faint rustle of wind through the pine trees broke the quiet. The land was harsh but beautiful, painted in shades of red, brown, and gold. Every canyon and ridge seemed to tell a story old as time itself. Daniel often thought about how many others had walked these same trails long before him. The native tribes, the travelers, the wanderers who had come chasing dreams or fleeing from something they could never name. He followed a narrow path that led toward the foothills, where he hoped to find deer. Their tracks were faint but visible near the edge of a frozen stream. He crouched down, running his hand along the marks in the dirt. 2 days old, he whispered to himself. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. Hours passed as he moved deeper into the wild. The land rose and fell like an endless wave of stone and brush. The air smelled of juniper and earth, and somewhere nearby water trickled faintly, a reminder that life, though hidden, still existed. Daniel's senses were alert. Every sound, every movement caught his attention. He had learned to read the forest like a book. The call of birds, the snapping of a twig, even the way the wind shifted carried meaning. By midday, the sun stood high, and the warmth began to chase away the chill. Daniel stopped at a rocky ledge overlooking a deep canyon. From here the world stretched endlessly, sharp ridges cutting across the horizon and below a narrow river glinting like silver thread. He sat for a moment, chewing on a piece of stale bread, letting the silence settle around him. As he rested, his eyes caught something unusual on the far side of the canyon. A faint movement, something small and light-colored, barely visible through the trees. At first he thought it was a deer. His heartbeat quickened. Slowly he stood and shaded his eyes, trying to see more clearly. The figure moved again, but something about it seemed strange. It wasn't the smooth, graceful step of an animal. It was hesitant, unsteady, almost human. Curiosity stirred in him stronger than caution. He decided to follow. Climbing down the rocky slope was slow and tiring, but Daniel moved carefully, testing each step before shifting his weight. The ground was uneven, and loose stones threatened to send him sliding into the ravine. When he finally reached the bottom, he paused to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the narrow trail that wound along the creek. He saw footprints in the soft earth, small, bare footprints. His brow furrowed. They were human, no doubt about it, and recent too. Someone had passed here not long ago. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. What was a person doing out here alone, barefoot in such wilderness? He followed the prints cautiously, his hand resting on the strap of his pack. The path led through a cluster of cottonwood trees, their pale trunks shining in the sunlight. The silence around him grew heavier with each step. Somewhere in the distance a crow called out, a lonely echoing sound that seemed to vanish into the endless sky. After nearly an hour, he came upon a small clearing beside the creek. The water shimmered in the light, breaking into gentle ripples around smooth stones, and there, lying half-hidden among the reeds, was a shape. Still, motionless, and faintly glimmering where the sunlight touched skin. Daniel froze. For a moment he thought his eyes deceived him. Then slowly he moved closer. What he saw made him draw in a deep, shocked breath. It was a woman. Her long black hair was tangled and dusted with sand, her skin pale beneath the layer of dirt and blood. She wore only the torn remains of what had once been a dress made of soft leather. Her body was thin, her feet scratched and bruised. She looked as if she had walked for days through the desert. Daniel could see she was breathing, shallow but steady. Relief and confusion mixed within him. He knelt beside her, unsure what to do. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked softly. There was no response. He reached for his canteen and poured a few drops of water onto his fingers, letting them fall onto her lips. After a moment, her eyes fluttered open, dark, sharp, and filled with both fear and exhaustion. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had seen Apache people before from a distance, but never like this. Never this close, never one in need. He knew what many settlers said about them, and what the Apache thought of white men. The land between them was divided not just by miles, but by pain and mistrust. He should have walked away. That was the safe thing to do. But he couldn't. Not when someone's life hung so close to ending. Gently, he lifted her head and offered another sip of water. She hesitated, eyes locked on his, searching for meaning in his face. Then with a trembling hand, she accepted it. Her lips moved as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Daniel looked around. The sun was lowering and shadows stretched long across the canyon. He couldn't leave her here. The nights in this land were cruel, colder than any man could bear without shelter. He took a slow breath, making his decision. "All right," he murmured quietly. "You're coming with me." He removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was light, far lighter than he expected, as he lifted her carefully in his arms. Step by step, he began the long climb back toward the ridge. The journey was hard, the path steep, and more than once he had to stop to rest. The woman barely stirred, though once her hand brushed against his arm, a faint gesture that felt almost like trust. By the time Daniel reached the higher ground, the sky had turned soft orange, fading into deep purple at the edges. The first stars were appearing. His small cabin lay a few miles away, beyond the line of pines that marked the edge of the valley. He pressed on, ignoring the growing ache in his legs. When he finally reached home, the moon had risen high. He laid the woman gently on the small bed near the fire. The warmth began to fill the room, wrapping them in soft, flickering light. Daniel removed his hat and sat beside her, watching her face as sleep claimed her again. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The forest seemed to breathe and slow, steady, alive. Daniel sat there in silence, listening to the sound, his mind filled with questions he could not answer. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had fate chosen to cross their paths on this lonely, frozen day? He didn't know it then, but this simple act of kindness, of bringing a stranger home instead of walking away, would change the course of his life for Eve. Morning light slipped quietly through the cracks in the cabin walls. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only a soft orange glow that danced across the wooden floor. Daniel opened his eyes slowly, still unsure if everything that happened yesterday was real or part of some strange dream, but then he turned his head and saw her, the woman he had carried from the canyon. She was still there, lying on his bed, wrapped in his old wool blanket. Her breathing was steady now, though her face still looked pale and tired. Her hair spread like dark silk across the pillow, shining faintly in the firelight. For a moment, Daniel just watched her. There was something peaceful about her presence, even in sleep. He couldn't help but wonder who she was and what had brought her here. The wilderness didn't forgive carelessness. No one ended up that far from home without a reason. He rose quietly and added a few pieces of wood to the fire. The smell of smoke and pine filled the room again. From a small iron pot, he poured water and placed it near the fire to warm. Then he reached for a piece of bread and a handful of dried berries, the last of his supplies. He hesitated. If he shared his food, he'd have little left for himself. But the thought of letting her go hungry didn't sit right in his heart. After a while, he heard a faint sound, a soft breath that turned into a sigh. He turned and saw her eyes open slowly. They were dark, deep, and alert. For a few seconds, she didn't move. She looked around the cabin, her gaze landing on the door, the window, and finally on him. Daniel stayed still, not wanting to frighten her. "You're safe," he said gently. "I found you near the creek. You were hurt." She blinked, her brow tightening slightly as if trying to understand his words. Her lips moved, forming quiet sounds in a language Daniel couldn't recognize. He shook his head softly. "I don't understand," he said. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers in a small cabin surrounded by miles of wild land. Then Daniel pointed to the cup of water beside her. "Drink," he said, holding it out with both hands. She hesitated but then reached for it. Her fingers brushed his for a moment. They were cold and delicate like leaves touched by frost. She took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his face. After finishing, she handed the cup back with a small nod. Daniel gave her a small smile. "You need to eat too," he said, placing the bread and berries beside her. She looked at them curiously, then took a piece of bread and began to chew slowly. He could tell she was still cautious. Every small sound and the creak of wood, the wind outside, made her eyes dart toward the door. Daniel didn't blame her. Out here, trust was rare and fear was easy to understand. To make her more comfortable, he moved to the far side of the room, busying himself with small chores, mending a broken strap, sweeping dust from the floor, checking his tools, but he could feel her watching him quietly, as if studying every movement. After a while, she spoke again. The words were soft, low, and rhythmic like a song carried on wind. Daniel didn't understand, but he recognized the tone. She was trying to thank him. He nodded and touched his chest, saying, Daniel." Then he pointed toward her and asked gently, "Name?" She hesitated before answering, her voice quiet but clear. "Tala," she said. "Tala," Daniel repeated, testing the sound. She gave a faint smile, the first one since she had opened her eyes, and nodded. The name suited her somehow. It carried a sense of the wild places, of wind and sky. The day passed slowly. Daniel tried to keep the cabin warm and clean. When he stepped outside to chop wood, the sky was gray with clouds. Snow might come again soon. He glanced at the smoke rising from his chimney and thought of the woman inside. Bringing her home had been the right thing to do, even if he didn't know what it might cost him later. When he returned, Tala was sitting up, watching the fire. Her blanket slipped from one shoulder and she pulled it back shyly when she saw him. Daniel set the wood near the hearth and said, "More warm soon." She nodded. He noticed her eyes following his hands, the way he stacked the logs, the way he lit a small flame, the way he poured water into a tin cup. She was learning through watching, the way people do when words can't cross the space between them. Later, when the wind began to blow harder outside, Daniel sat near the fire and pulled out a small wooden flute. It was old, carved years ago during quiet evenings like this. He began to play a slow tune, something soft and thoughtful. The sound filled the cabin like a calm breath. Tala listened quietly, her eyes reflecting the light of the flames. When he stopped, she smiled again. A real one this time. And nodded as if to say she understood the feeling behind the music even without words. That night, the wind howled through the trees and snow began to fall. Daniel checked the door and windows to make sure the cold wouldn't creep in. Tala was already lying down again, her face peaceful in sleep. For a moment he thought of how strange it was. Just yesterday he had been alone hunting for food in a land that seemed empty. Now there was another heartbeat in the room, another presence beside the fire. He sat at the table, staring into the flames. His thoughts wandered back to the people in the nearest town, the settlers who had come west with dreams of land and gold. They didn't trust anyone who wasn't like them. If they knew he had brought an Apache woman into his home, they'd whisper and judge. Some might even come asking questions, but Daniel had never cared much for gossip. The wilderness had taught him to listen to his own sense of right and wrong. Over the next few days, Tala grew stronger. She began to walk slowly around the cabin, touching things gently as if trying to learn their purpose. Daniel showed her simple tasks, how to pour water, how to stir the soup, how to wrap her wounds with clean cloth. She watched carefully, always quiet but always paying attention. They found ways to speak without words. When she was hungry, she pointed to her stomach. When she wanted water, she mimed drinking. Daniel responded with small gestures and smiles. It was simple, but it worked. One afternoon, he saw her standing near the window looking out at the snow-covered hills. Her face was thoughtful, distant. "Home?" Daniel asked softly, pointing toward the horizon. She turned to him, her eyes softening, then nodded slowly. There was sadness in that nod, a kind of longing that words could never explain. He wanted to tell her she would be safe here, that she could stay as long as she needed. But he knew she missed her people. Everyone belonged somewhere, and this cabin was only a shelter, not her home. That evening, as they shared a meal of soup and bread, Daniel noticed how much had changed in only a few days. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt calm. like the quiet between two trees that had stood together through many storms. When she smiled now, it reached her eyes. And when Daniel caught himself smiling back, he realized how rare that had become in his life. The wilderness outside might still be cold and unforgiving, but inside the cabin warmth had returned, not just from the fire, but from something deeper, something gentle that didn't need to be spoken. Daniel didn't know what the coming days would bring. He didn't know if Tala's people would come searching for her, or if the townsfolk might one day find out. But as he watched her fall asleep beside the fire that night, he felt certain of one thing. Meeting her was no accident. Maybe he had gone hunting for food, but what he had truly found was a reminder that kindness still had a place in this wild, endless land, and that even two strangers could find light in the middle of the cold. And as the snow fell softly outside, covering the world in quiet white, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered her name to the fire, a promise that he would keep her safe, no matter what tomorrow might bring. Days turned into weeks, and winter slowly began to loosen its hold on the land. The snow outside the cabin started to melt, uncovering the earth that had slept beneath it for months. Little streams of water trickled down the slopes, carrying away the last bits of frost. The forest was waking up, and so was the quiet bond growing inside that small wooden house. Daniel had grown used to hearing the soft sounds of Tala moving about the cabin. At first she had been shy and cautious, but now she walked with more ease, her steps light and graceful. She helped with small things, sweeping the floor, washing the tin cups, folding the blankets. She spoke little, but her eyes carried meaning, and Daniel learned to understand her without needing many words. Some mornings, they sat together outside, sipping warm tea made from herbs Daniel had gathered. The air would be fresh and full of promise. Tala often looked toward the distant hills, her gaze steady and full of longing. Daniel could tell she missed her home, her people, and her freedom. Still, she never complained. There was peace in her silence, a strength that Daniel respected deeply. One afternoon, Daniel showed her how to plant small seeds in the garden behind the cabin. The ground was still cold, but he told her that soon, with enough sun and care, green life would appear again. Tala listened carefully, kneeling beside him, her fingers brushing the soil as if greeting an old friend. When he smiled at her, she smiled back, a soft, quiet smile that warmed the space between them. They began to share small parts of their worlds. Daniel would name objects, table, door, sky, and she would repeat them, her accent smooth and musical. Then she would point at something and say its name in her own language. He tried to repeat it, always making her laugh with his clumsy pronunciation. The sound of her laughter filled the cabin like sunlight through glass, and Daniel found himself smiling more often than he had in years. But the world outside their little home was not as kind. Word traveled fast in small places, even across miles of empty land. One evening, while Daniel was chopping wood, he noticed smoke in the distance, not from his chimney, but from the direction of the settlement to the south. He knew that sooner or later someone would ride out to check on him. The settlers were always curious, and sometimes curiosity turned into trouble. A few days later, his guess came true. Just after noon, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Daniel looked up from the garden to see two men approaching on horseback. They were neighbors from town, Tom Barlow and Henry Case, men he had traded with before, men who liked to talk more than they liked to listen. "Afternoon, Whitmore," Tom called as he dismounted. "Haven't seen you in weeks. Thought you might have frozen out here." Daniel wiped his hands on his coat and forced a calm smile. "Still breathing," he said. "Winter's been rough, but I've managed." Henry glanced toward the cabin door. "You got company?" he asked, his tone too casual to be innocent. Daniel hesitated for a second. "Someone I found hurt near the canyon," he said finally. "Been helping her get well." The two men exchanged looks. "A woman?" Tom asked. Daniel nodded. "Her name's Tala." There was a pause, short but heavy. Tom's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Tala," he repeated. "That sounds like one of them Apache names." Daniel's stomach tightened. "She's just a person," he said evenly. "She needed help." Henry gave a low whistle. "You sure that's wise? Folks in town won't like hearing you're keeping one of them under your roof. They'll think you've gone soft." Daniel met his gaze. "Let them think what they want," he said simply. I did what was right. The men didn't push further, but their silence said enough. After a few minutes, they left, riding back the way they came. Daniel stood there for a long time after the sound of their horses faded, the weight of their words lingering like cold air. When he went back inside, Tala looked up at him, sensing something was wrong. Daniel tried to smile, but it came out thin. "Some men from town stopped by," he said. "They might not understand why you're here. But don't worry, you're safe with me." Tala tilted her head slightly, reading the unease in his eyes. She placed her hand over her heart, then on his arm, a quiet gesture of trust. It said more than words could have. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat near the fire, listening to the soft crackle of burning wood. His mind was restless. He had spent years trying to keep peace with everyone, the settlers, the land, himself. But now he stood between two worlds that didn't mix easily. The next morning, the forest was full of fog. Daniel decided to teach Tala how to fish in the nearby stream, hoping the fresh air would ease both their minds. They walked through the mist in silence, their boots leaving faint prints in the wet earth. The sound of water grew louder until they reached the creek, its surface rippling with silver light. Daniel showed her how to carve a small stick into a fishing spear. She watched closely, then tried it herself, her hand steady and sure. They worked side by side, sharing quiet smiles when the line trembled with movement. When Tala caught her first fish, her face lit up with pure joy. She looked at him proudly, and Daniel laughed. A warm, honest sound that scattered the weight from his heart, if only for a while. As days passed, they built small pieces of routine together. Tala gathered herbs from the woods and taught Daniel which ones could heal wounds or flavor food. In return, Daniel showed her how to mend tools and use the small stove. They didn't need to speak much. Understanding had found its own language between them. But the peace didn't last forever. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Daniel saw movement along the ridge. A group of riders, faint and far, passed between the trees. Their outlines were dark against the fading light. He knew those weren't settlers. Something in the way they moved told him they belonged to Tala's people. He turned to her gently. "Your people," he said, pointing toward the ridge. She froze, eyes wide, then walked to the doorway and looked out. For a long time she said nothing. The air between them felt thick with unspoken emotion, hope, fear, confusion. That night she sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly. Daniel could see the storm of thoughts in her eyes. He wanted to tell her that whatever she chose, he would respect it. But before he could speak, she looked up and whispered, "They come soon." Daniel nodded. "I know," he said softly. "And when they do, I'll make sure no harm comes to you." She shook her head slowly. "No harm," she said. "They my people." "I understand," he replied. And he did. The next few days were filled with a quiet kind of waiting. The air outside seemed to hum with unseen movement. Daniel could feel it. Something was changing. The world he had built inside that little cabin, the fragile peace he and Tala had found, was about to be tested. Yet in those final quiet moments before the storm, there was still warmth, the smell of smoke, the sound of water, the gentle rhythm of two lives that had somehow crossed paths. And though Daniel didn't know what the future held, one truth had already taken root in his heart. He no longer saw Tala as a stranger or a guest. She had become a part of his days, his thoughts, his quiet hopes. Out in the wild land where silence carried more meaning than words, they had found something rare, a friendship shaped not by language or race, but by simple kindness and the shared will to keep going, even when the world refused to understand. The morning air was cool and calm, yet Daniel felt a strange tension in his chest. The forest outside looked peaceful, sunlight filtering through the tall trees, birds singing faintly in the distance, but something was different. He could sense it the way animals sense rain before it falls. The stillness had changed. Tala stood near the window, her eyes fixed on the far ridge. The early light touched her face, soft and golden, yet her expression was distant. She hadn't said much since spotting the riders 2 days earlier. She moved quietly, almost as if she didn't want the forest to hear her. Daniel tried to keep things normal, cooking breakfast and tending to small chores. But even his hands felt heavier than usual. When he finally sat down, he looked at her carefully. "They're close, aren't they?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the horizon. Yes, she said. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the emotion underneath, a quiet mixture of fear and longing. Daniel leaned back, sighing softly. He didn't know what to expect. Would they come peacefully? Would they think he had harmed her? He didn't want trouble with anyone, not the settlers and certainly not the Apache, but he couldn't stop what was coming. As the day went on, Tala began to prepare in her own quiet way. She washed her hair and braided it neatly. She took one of Daniel's soft blankets and folded it around her shoulders like a shawl. Every movement she made seemed meaningful, like she was saying goodbye to this place without using words. Daniel watched, unsure what to say. "You don't have to go if you're not ready," he said finally. Tala looked at him then, her dark eyes deep and full of thought. "Home is calling," she said softly. "But my heart—" She paused, placing her hand over her chest. "Oh, it's quiet here." Daniel smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Then stay," he said gently. "You're safe here." She shook her head, her braids swaying slightly. "No one can hide from who they are," she said. "You have your land. I have my people. The wind always finds its way home." He wanted to argue, but the calmness in her voice stopped him. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had only known her for a short time, but in that time she had reminded him that kindness was not weakness, and that the wild world outside was full of both danger and grace. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Daniel noticed something moving between the trees. Shadows, soft at first, then clearer. A group of figures approached the cabin, silent as the wind. His heart began to pound. He stepped to the door, not to block it, but to meet whatever came. Tala stood behind him, her hand lightly touching his shoulder. "It is all right," she whispered. "They come for me." From the edge of the trees, 5 men appeared, dressed in light, earth-colored clothes, their faces calm but watchful. They stopped a short distance away. One of them stepped forward, older, strong, his eyes wise but sharp. He spoke in a steady tone, his words flowing in the language of Tala's people. Tala answered softly, her voice steady. The two spoke for a while, their tones changing, quiet at first, then firm, then gentle again. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotion in their faces. It wasn't anger. It was something else, maybe caution, maybe sorrow. After a few moments, the older man looked toward Daniel. His gaze was unreadable, yet not cruel. Tala spoke again, saying Daniel's name. The man nodded slightly, then stepped closer, speaking slowly in broken English. "You help her?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, I found her hurt near the creek. I only helped." The man studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "She's safe now," he said simply. Daniel looked at Tala. Her eyes were wet, but she stood tall. "They want me to come," she said quietly. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Then you should go," he said, forcing the words past the lump in his chest. "It's where you belong." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying the smell of wood smoke and earth. Tala stepped closer to him, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, sadness, maybe both. "You gave me life again," she whispered. "You see me not as enemy, not as ghost, but as human. I will not forget." Daniel felt the weight of her words settle deep inside him. "And I won't forget you," he said softly. She reached out and took his hand, holding it for a heartbeat that felt like forever. Then she turned and walked toward her people. The older man placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her gently. One by one, they disappeared back into the forest, leaving Daniel standing alone by the doorway. The silence that followed was heavy and endless. The cabin, once filled with quiet warmth and shared laughter, now felt too still. The fire burned low, but Daniel didn't move to add more wood. He just sat at the table, staring at the spot where she had stood. Night came, and with it a loneliness he hadn't known before. The sound of the wind outside reminded him of her words. The wind always finds its way home. He wondered if she was safe, if she looked up at the same stars that now shimmered above the roof. Days passed slowly. The forest returned to its old rhythm, birds singing, streams flowing, the world turning as it always had. But Daniel felt something had changed inside him. He found himself walking to the creek each morning, the place where he had first found her. He would sit there for a while, listening to the water and remembering the soft way she had said his name. One evening, as he sat by the fire, he noticed something near the doorway, a small piece of cloth folded neatly on the floor. It was the blanket Tala had worn the day she left. He picked it up gently, feeling the soft fabric between his hands. A small charm made of feathers and beads was tied to one corner. Daniel smiled faintly. She had left him a sign, a piece of her world to stay with him. He placed it carefully on the mantel above the fire, where the light could touch it. As spring came, new life filled the valley. The trees turned green again, and wildflowers painted the hills in color. Daniel began to trade again, traveling into town when needed, though he spoke little about what had happened. When people asked about the woman, he simply said, "She found her way home." But sometimes, late at night, he would step outside and listen to the wind moving through the pines. If the night was still enough, he could almost hear her voice, soft and distant, like a song carried by the breeze. He realized then that what had happened between them wasn't about rescue or debt. It was about two people who had met in a wild and lonely place and reminded each other what it meant to be human. The memory of her became part of the land itself, in the rustle of the trees, in the shimmer of the creek, in the quiet strength that lived in his heart. And though the world would never know their story, Daniel did not need anyone to understand. He knew that kindness once given never truly disappears. It stays, like a spark, waiting to light someone else's path. That spark had changed him. He no longer hunted with the same purpose as before. The need for survival remained, but something deeper had taken root. Respect for the life that surrounded him, for every living soul that shared this earth. He often thought of Tala, her courage, her calm, her eyes that saw beyond fear. And somewhere in the great silence of the land, he hoped she thought of him too. The wilderness had taken many things from Daniel over the years, but this time, it had given him something precious and a memory, a truth, a quiet kind of love that needed no promise and no words. The seasons changed quietly, the way life always does when no one is watching. The snow melted from the mountaintops and soft green shoots began to cover the ground where frost once ruled. The rivers ran full again, singing their endless songs through the valleys. The wilderness had come alive with new color and sound, yet Daniel Whitmore felt both joy and emptiness in the same breath. It had been months since Tala left. Her absence filled the cabin like a soft echo, not painful anymore, just quiet. Daniel had learned to live with that silence. Sometimes he would speak to her in his mind, the way one talks to an old friend. He would tell her about the sunrise, about the deer tracks he found near the creek, about how the first blossoms had appeared near the garden they once planted together. It made him feel as if she was still near, listening through the wind. Each morning, Daniel woke before the sun, just as he always had. He would step outside with a tin cup of coffee, the steam rising gently into the cold air. The forest smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sky above was painted in colors that no brush could capture. He often thought of how Tala would have loved that sight, how she might have smiled and said something in her soft, melodic tongue. Over time, Daniel noticed that the world around him didn't feel the same as before. He used to walk the woods with one goal in mind, to find food to survive another day. But now every tree, every stream, every bird seemed to carry more meaning. He began to move through the land with care, taking only what he needed. When he hunted, he offered a silent thought of respect before taking aim. When he gathered herbs or wood, he left something behind, on a small branch, a prayer, a moment of thanks. He had learned these quiet gestures from Tala, not through words, but through the way she treated every part of nature as if it were alive and listening. Her way of seeing the world had changed him. The wilderness, once wild and harsh, now felt like a living friend. Sometimes he would find footprints near the creek, light, soft, and familiar. At first, he thought they belonged to travelers passing through, but something in him liked to believe they were hers. He would follow the prints for a while until they disappeared into the forest. He never went too far. He didn't want to chase ghosts. Instead, he'd smile quietly and whisper, "You still walk this land, don't you?" Word about Daniel had spread quietly among the nearby towns. The settlers still saw him as the quiet man who lived alone in the hills, but there was something different in how they spoke of him now. When people needed help, fixing a roof, mending a fence, finding lost livestock, they turned to him. He never refused, He asked for little in return, sometimes nothing at all. The same kindness he once gave to a stranger, he now gave to everyone around him. One spring day, a group of children from the town wandered into his clearing. They had followed a stray dog into the woods and found themselves lost. When Daniel discovered them near the creek, frightened and cold, he smiled gently and guided them back to the cabin. He gave them food, wrapped them in blankets, and lit the fire high until their fear melted away. "Don't tell your parents to worry," he said kindly. "The forest only teaches us when we listen." The children laughed at his words, not quite understanding them, but something in his calm tone made them feel safe. When their parents came to take them home, Daniel became a name spoken with gratitude. From that day on, more people began to visit him, not out of suspicion, but out of respect. Over time, Daniel's small cabin turned into a meeting place for travelers and locals alike. He helped build bridges across creeks, repaired broken wagons, and taught young hunters how to track without waste. He spoke little about himself, but people felt peace in his presence. Some said he carried the spirit of the land. Others said he had been touched by something sacred. One evening, many years later, Daniel sat outside as the sun dipped behind the mountains. His beard had turned gray and fine lines marked his face, but his eyes still held the same quiet strength. The air was filled with the soft hum of insects and the distant cry of an eagle. In his hands he held the small charm Tala had left him, the one with feathers and beads tied to a piece of cloth. He ran his thumb over it gently, feeling the familiar smoothness of the beads. "You changed me," he whispered to the wind. "Without saying a word, you changed everything." As twilight deepened, he thought he heard faint singing from far away, a soft flowing sound like a memory carried by the air. He closed his eyes and listened. It wasn't frightening or sad. It was gentle, like a promise. That night he dreamed of her. She was standing by the creek, dressed in light, her hair loose and shining in the moonlight. She smiled at him, the same quiet, peaceful smile he remembered. She said nothing, but her eyes spoke 1,000 words. Then she turned and walked toward the hills, her figure fading into the mist. Daniel woke with a tear on his cheek, but his heart felt light. Years passed and time moved like the slow turning of the river. Daniel grew older, but he never left the place he called home. People often came to visit him, children he had once helped, travelers seeking shelter, even families who just wanted to hear his stories. He never spoke about himself much, but sometimes, when the fire was warm and the night long, he would tell them about a day long ago when he went hunting for food and found something far more precious. He spoke not with pride, but with calm reflection. He told them about kindness, about courage, about seeing beyond fear and difference. He said, "The heart knows what's right, even when the world tells you otherwise. Listen to it. It never lies." When Daniel finally passed away one spring morning, the town mourned quietly. They buried him near the edge of the forest, where the sun touched the ground first each day. Some said a soft wind blew through the trees that day, carrying a faint melody no one could explain. A few even claimed they saw an eagle circling high above the ridge, its wings bright against the sky. In time, travelers passing through the area would hear about him, the hunter who became a healer, as the locals called him. They spoke of his kindness, his wisdom, and the strange peace that always seemed to surround his old cabin. And some nights, when the wind was gentle and the forest was still, people swore they could hear the soft hum of two voices mingling, one deep and steady, one light and musical, as if Daniel and Tala were still there, watching over the land together. The cabin slowly weathered with the years. The roof gathered moss and the wooden walls turned silver with age, but no one dared to tear it down. It stood like a quiet monument to a story that belonged not just to one man and one woman, but to the wild earth itself, to the timeless truth that compassion can bridge any distance, even between two worlds. And though their names faded from memory, the spirit of their meeting remained, whispered by the streams, sung by the wind, and carried in the hearts of those who still believed that goodness, once given, never disappears. It was said that sometimes, on the calmest nights, if one stood near the old cabin, they could see two shadows by the fire, a man with gray hair and a woman with long, dark braids, sitting side by side in silence, surrounded by the peace they had once created. In the quiet of the wilderness, where the heart speaks louder than words, their story lived on, not of hunting or survival, but of kindness, understanding, and the strange way fate can bring two souls together in the most unexpected of places.